Stories of Futures Past presents 5 stories featuring Becoming the Alien. Bad Memory by Patrick Fahy. Marty the Martian by Arnold Marmor. Metamorphosis by Mike Curry. Hold On to Your Body by Richard O. Lewis. The Wind People by Marion Zimmer Bradley. Bad Memory by Patrick Fahy, originally published in Galaxy Magazine, December 1960. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Ex-Vector Commander Jim Channing strode purposefully to the reception desk of Planet Enterprises Incorporated. "I want," he told the well-built blonde who was making an interested survey of his lean features, "to buy a planet." "Yes, sir." Her interest evaporated. She took a card from a filing cabinet and handed it to him. "If you will just fill this out." It was a simple questionnaire, type, location, size, and Channing's stylo moved rapidly over it. He hesitated only at the last stark question. "How much are you prepared to pay?" Then he wrote neatly in the space provided, 100,000 credits. That was exactly the amount of his signing-off bonus. It also represented his total finances. The unimaginative minds that calculated the pay of a red-blooded space officer didn't take into account all the attractive ways of spending it that a rumbustious pioneer Vector provided. He gave the blonde the card, and she wrote a name on it. The smile she gave him was altogether impersonal. She liked the look of the big, gangling fellow with space written all over his bronzed face and crinkled blue eyes. But she said, "Will you come this way, please?" The name on the desk identified him as Mr. Folan, and he was a tall, affable man. "I think we can suit you, Commander, Mr. Channing," he said, "though what we have in mind mightn't be quite as large as you wish. Earth-type planets come rather high, you know. Now, if you were to choose a Sirius or a Vega type—" "Thank you, no," Jim said firmly. He had heard too much about the hazards of alien-type planets. "In that case," Mr. Folan said busily, "let's see what we have available." A month later, the doors of the automatic shuttle slid across and admitted Jim Channing to the third planet of Phylox Beta. It also disgorged one spaceboat, a clutter of machinery, 1,000 tons of strawberry plants, and a fully equipped house. While he was still taking in the first glimpse of his future home, the massive doors slammed shut and the giant ship took off smoothly and silently. A moment later it winked into subspace. He was in business. The planet possessed only one sizable island. It could hardly be dignified by the name of continent. The rest was covered by a vast ocean. Still, as Folan had explained, he couldn't really expect anything more, not in the line of an Earth-type anyway, for the money. He spent a week figuring out the remote controls that operated the planting machinery. Once it clanked into operation, it worked entirely on its own. He had only to push a few buttons to send it lumbering in new directions, and the big island steadily took on a resemblance to a huge strawberry patch, while Channing fished and lounged in the sun. When the galactic trade agent came, the strawberries were waiting for him, neatly piled into a mountain of gleaming cans. He was a friendly, talkative little man, glad to exercise his tongue again after the lonely months in space. "What are you growing here?" he asked Channing. "Strawberries." The friendly smile disappeared. "Every planet in the galaxy seems to be growing strawberries this year. I can't even give 'em away." "But I thought the Ursa Major colonies—" The little man shook his head. "So does everyone else. There's 1,000,000 tons of strawberries the colonies can't use headed there already. Now if it was Upclin seeds—" "Upclin seeds?" The agent looked at him in surprise. "You mean you haven't heard about Upclin seeds?" No, not a thing. Well, of course, you're a newcomer. It's this new race that's been discovered somewhere in the sack. They're as rich as all get out, and they have a passion for upklin seeds. Trouble is, they can't grow them on local planets, and they're offering fancy prices to anybody that can supply them. I paid 1,000 credits a bushel for them to your next-door neighbour on the 4th planet last week. Got 100 bushels. Channing did a bit of mental arithmetic. 100,000 credits for one crop. Phew! Could I grow them here? The agent shook his head. You need plenty of soft marsh and a Jupiter-type atmosphere. Then he had a sudden idea, and he spoke long and seriously to Channing, explaining quite a few things that were new to him. Channing was still considering them, staring thoughtfully at the ground after the little man left. Next day, Channing took off for the nearest subspace center, and a few hours later he was in Mr. Folan's office at Planet Enterprises, gingerly balancing his cap on his knee. Mr. Folan's sleek head nodded as Channing made his points, and when it was finished, the executive pressed a buzzer and called for the file. You realize, Mr. Channing, he said conversationally as he turned over the pages, that what you are asking for will be the most expensive undertaking. I know that, Channing said eagerly, but upklin seeds are such a surefire proposition that I thought Planet Enterprises might be willing to do the job on a percentage basis. Mr. Folan wrote some figures on the margin of the folder and considered deeply. Yes, he said at last, I think it would work out on a 70-30 split. 70-30? Mr. Folan inclined his head graciously. 70% for Planet Enterprises and 30 for yourself. Channing said slowly, That's a bit steep. In a few brisk words, Mr. Folan showed just why he was an executive of Planet Enterprises Incorporated. He gave Channing the figures for transforming the planet's characteristics to those of Jupiter. He told him what acreage of upklin seeds he could grow and the exact profit to be expected. Channing's share should be about 150,000 credits per crop. Fighting a rearguard battle, Channing said, Your 350,000 won't look so bad on the balance sheet either. Folan reeled off his figures again with practised glibness. Channing had the sudden suspicion that his proposition wasn't entirely unexpected, but the figures sounded reasonable, and he had to admit that Planet Enterprises was risking a great deal of money. Then there is the not inconsiderable cost of your own metamorphosis, Mr. Channing, Folan added. Huh? Said Channing. There followed the most excruciating half-hour of Channing's life. Proposition followed explanation, counter-explanation, and followed counter-proposition. At the end of that time he emerged from the office with a stricken look and a small white card. The blonde receptionist read the look correctly, and definitely and finally crossed him off her list. For a Jube, Dick wasn't at all bad-looking. His 4 legs growing directly from the bottom of the muscular hairy trunk were strong and sturdy, always a mark of handsomeness in a male, for the legs had to take most of the strain of a gravitational pull several times that of Earth. He had 3 flexible tentacles, a thin melon slice for a mouth, but nothing resembling a nose. He didn't need one, since he breathed through a set of gills at the sides of his head. He remembered vaguely that he had once been Jim Channing, an Earthman, but the memory had nearly faded. He had been warned of that he would soon forget he had ever been anything except what he was now, but he had already forgotten the warning. Phinox Beta 3 had changed too, in as great a degree. The wide ocean had become a turgid, soupy mush, covered by the trailing growths of the upklin flowers. The blue skies had turned an angry red, and the sharp wind that rustled the hair on his squat body was almost pure methane. He waddled down to the low disc-shaped skimmer and started the jets. As it pushed its way through the clinging masses of the upklin flowers, he surveyed his crop happily. This was his second crop, and it promised to be even better than the first. It was going to be a very wealthy buck, he told himself. He could buy... His mind floundered. He didn't know what Jubes longed for, what they sought wealth for. He was certain at the same time that there was a flaw in his contentment, that something was missing. What it was missing dropped from the sky a few days later. It came in a spaceboat, and was his neighbour from Phinox Beta 4. Her body hair was a rich golden brown, and she wore pretty bracelets, studded with basim stones on each of her 4 legs. Kim Dick's single eye, with its perpendicular outer eyelids and horizontal nictating inner membranes to filter out the infrared rays, shone with an emotion that was more than pleasure. Her thoughts flooded his mind. There was a warm recognition of his admiration and a delicious suggestion that it wasn't unacceptable. "The agent told me you were upland farming. I came to see if I could be of any help," she told him. The sentences rang like golden bells within his burgeoning consciousness. He tried to shape his answering thought coherently, but his lack of telepathic experience betrayed him. She flinched momentarily beneath the raw, undirected stream of passionate love that overwhelmed her mind. Then an answering wave of shy, tender awareness and acquiescence lathed his senses. Without the clumsy barrier of speech between them, they had scaled in a few pulsating moments the shining heights of love and devotion that human passions sometimes cannot find in a lifetime of searching. Kumduk had never been so happy. They decided to farm the 2 planets together so they could be with each other always. There was sound economic sense in this. With both of them helping, the output of each planet would be nearly doubled. It meant a huge increase in administrative and paperwork for Kumduk, but he didn't mind that. Often as he pored over account books and production figures, a tremulous, shy devotion would envelop him in a gauzy mental cloud, and he would lay down his stylo and answer Alma with all the great love that surged within him. As the months passed, his happiness increased. The perfect attunement of their minds excluded all the scalding jealousies and the offended silences of misunderstanding that can mar the most loving human relationships. They did not need to see each other. The physical presence of the beloved was unimportant. They loved more with their minds than with their bodies. It seemed improbable that such a glorious idyll would ever be disturbed. Then one morning, a shuttle spacer came silently out of the red sky and landed beside the house. Dick waddled toward it, impelled by a carefully built-in series of reflexes which he had completely forgotten about, and entered its gaping maw. He never once looked at Alma, and the passionate entreaties that echoed through his mind only roused in him a dull irritation. Jim Channing again found himself in Mr. Folan's office. The figures the tall, sleek-haired man was reading out to him made tuneful music. Even when Planet Enterprise's massive deduction was made, his share was comfortingly more than $1 million. "Not bad payment, Mr. Channing, for 5 years of life. In any case, it's all over now, just a bad memory." The executive smiled at him from his comfortable, familiar chair, aware of the torrents of confused thoughts hidden behind the grey eyes. When he had come out of the stupor that succeeded the almost disintegrating effects of his re-metamorphosis, Jim Channing remembered clearly the terms of the bargain he had made. He was to become a Jube, a living nightmare, living in a nightmare world for 5 years. At the end of that time, Planet Enterprises promised him he would be given back his humanity and would have earned enough money to keep him in luxury for the rest of his life. They had kept their promise, to the letter. He felt it ungrateful of him that his paramount emotion was fury. He had been happy. No human attachment could ever make him as happy again. He longed for the glorious love and trust he had shared during that tremendous 5 years. Perhaps he had been a repulsive monster from whom any woman would run screaming. But he didn't want a woman. He wanted Alma. He said, picking his words with the greatest care, "Would a further metamorphosis be possible?" Folan's jaw dropped. It was a question he had never expected to hear from any of the men who had taken the terrible choice for the glittering reward he held out to them. Most of them had picked up their vouchers and asked the way to the nearest tavern. Many of the alien races did not find alcohol compatible with their metabolisms. A few had inquired tentatively about his current receptionist. Planet Enterprises had a big turnover in pretty receptionists, but they didn't lose them to men who had been unhuman horrors for 5 years. One big red-haired character had wanted to start a private war against the Syrians, whose brother he had been until 2 days previously. But none of them had wanted to go back. He said, "It's possible, Mr. Channing, but I must tell you that a second metamorphosis is very expensive, and is permanent." "You mean if I become a Jube again, I must stay one?" The executive nodded. Channing gestured toward the payment voucher. "You said it was expensive. Is there enough there to cover it?" Folan looked curiously at him. "Yes, more than enough." He waited to hear what the big man would say next. Channing licked dry lips. A terrible doubt assailed him. Maybe Arnold had been metamorphosed too. Maybe she had returned to her former self, whatever that may have been, while he sat here. He looked down at the big freckled hands resting on his knees. They were trembling, and his palms felt moist. "Is the period of metamorphosis always for a term of 5 years?" "Invariably. No other term is possible in the present state of our knowledge of the technique, except permanency." A great sigh escaped Channing. That was all right, then. Arnold was genuinely a Jube. The agent had told him about her, mentioned her by name, he remembered now, had said that she was upland farming on the neighboring planet. If she had been metamorphosed, she would have been taken from him more than a year ago. He tossed his cap on the table decisively and stood up. "All right, I'll take the permanent treatment." Dick sucked the methane through his gills with satisfaction. It was good to be home again. He had forgotten already that he had ever been Jim Channing, that he would never be human again. He did not know that less than 5 minutes after the shuttle ship had borne him off to Galactic Enterprises, Arnold had sent a spaceboat hurtling toward the fiery orb of Phyllox Beta, mad with the grief of having lost him. It would not have concerned him much if he had known. Jubes make tender and devoted lovers, but they are notorious for having exceedingly bad memories. The End. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. Marty the Martian by Arnold Marmor, originally published in Imagination Stories of Science and Fantasy, August 1954. Narrated by Tom Trussel. It's still very clear in my mind. The whole episode, the afternoon visit to Marston's office, the trip to Mars, and the journey back. It was one of those warm summer afternoons. All one craved for was a patch of green grass to recline on, and maybe a faint breeze to tinkle one's forehead. I was sure of the grass and hopeful for the breeze. But one of Marston's messengers popped up, and the grass and the breeze would have to wait. After all, Marston was my boss. He had his office in the Empire State Building. Norbert Marston was the owner of the Marston Circus, the greatest, biggest, loudest circus in the world. And if you don't believe it, ask Mr. Marston. "Sit down, Nick," he invited, speaking from one corner of his mouth as the other corner was busy chewing a dollar cigar. Marston was a small man with sleek black hair, a small man with big ideas. I sat down. "Nick, you're the best bring 'em back alive man I've got, the best." This was very true. "You've got a job for me," I said. That's correct. So why the build-up? Tell me what you want. I want something that no other circus has. You must be kidding. You have every known animal there is. Why, the Bushmaster I brought you 2 months ago is the longest. It isn't exactly an animal I want. Oh? You mean you want a performer? What the hell have I got to do with... What I want is out of this world. A different kind of act? I still say, I want a Martian. I was glad I didn't have a mirror in front of my face. I could imagine how foolish I looked with my mouth hanging open. I even have a name picked out for him, Marston persisted. Marty, the Martian. What do you think of that? I stood up slowly. Let me know when you've recovered. Marston came round the desk. Sit down. Now listen to me. Did you ever hear of a man named Hendrik Ritter? No. The greatest scientist in the world. He's been working for me for over a year. I hired him to do one particular job for me, to concoct a fuel that will get a spaceship to Mars and back. Well, it's done. Did you ever hear of a man named Sam Young? Same answer as before. He's a designer for airships, the best in the business. He's finished a job for me. And, Nick, it's already built, and I've got Joe Rohn working for me. I've heard of him, I said. The greatest pilot in the world, Marston said. The greatest this, the greatest that, and for what? Why, the ship probably won't get off the ground. Marston chewed furiously on his cigar. But what if it does get off the ground? What if it does get to Mars? All right, so what? How do you know there's life on Mars? There is. I hired the greatest... Oh no, I groaned. I believe you, I believe you. So now we're on Mars. You capture a Martian and bring him back. What if he doesn't care to be captured? What do I pay you for? I thought this out, then said, to capture Martians. Exactly. You wouldn't settle for a moon maiden, would you? I've heard they're cute and sexy. A Martian, he was very adamant. I'll have the greatest attraction in the world, Nick. I'm the kind who gets what he wants. I've spent over $3 million on this project, and I'm ready to spend another $3 million. Just get me my Martian, and you'll be a rich man. You'll be rich enough to quit working for me and to tell me to go to hell. You'd like that, wouldn't you? I'd like that very much. 2 weeks later, we went to Arizona. A week after that, we took off. I didn't really think we would, but we did. Just me and Joe Rohn, 2 men in a spaceship. A huge metal tube hurtling through the longest and blackest of nights. Joe Rohn was a good-looking chap. Good-looking, young, and excited. He was the first to pilot a ship to Mars. He was looking ahead to the glory that awaited him. We landed on Mars. We put on helmets that Ritter and Young had made for us. We stepped down the metal ladder. They were there, waiting for us. I'd rather have faced a bushmaster or a rhino. They stood on 3 legs. They had globe bellies, tiny heads, and no necks. They were of a colour I'd never seen before. They had 2 arms with 2 hands attached to each arm. I suppose they were hands. They were more like claws. I stood frozen solid. Joe Rohn screamed and turned to run back up the ladder. A beam flashed, and Joe fell forward, silent and very dead. After that, it was all a blank. When I came to, I was strapped down by metal clasps on a long board made of some kind of marble. I was alone for some time. I don't remember how long it was before one of them appeared. He stood by my side, looking down at me. His eyes were purple. There were no whites. "You have come a long way," he said. You speak English?" We used a 64V machine on you. We learned your language, your thoughts, your name. We know about Norbert Marston, a very enterprising man, it seems. What are you going to do with me? We haven't decided yet. So you are going to take one of us back with you for Marston's circus, to exhibit one of us to your stupid race. My followers wanted to kill you when this information was learned, but I believe I have a better idea. He went away. I yelled for him to come back. I yelled till my throat was dry. Eventually, he did come back. He came back with Joe Rohn and myself. I want you to meet Clara and Grat, he said. They've taken over your bodies. You will take theirs, and return to Marston. We have a transformer machine to accomplish this, only we never had an opportunity to use it until you were so gracious as to visit us. He spoke on, telling me of his idea. I shuddered and wished for death. I begged him to kill me. Then a contraption was fitted over me, and it hummed, and I passed out. I remember the trip back to Earth. I'm no longer Nick Faber. I'm Marty the Martian. What a cute title Marston has hung on me. I've got a nice home, and I get plenty to eat. Only my home is a cage, and it's made of glass. People come from all over the world just to see me, and Marston has been to see me every day. He chews on his big cigar, and there's a smile on his face a yard wide. I tried to talk to my keepers, but all I can manage is some crazy kind of gibberish. I also see Clara and Grat, but they're only there when Marston is around. They're keeping very close to him. My being transformed into a Martian was just part of it. Clara and Grat were going to carry out the rest of it. On one dark night, and very soon, Clara, Grat, and Marston were going to disappear. Maybe I was the greatest attraction on Earth, but Norbert Marston was going to be the greatest attraction on Mars.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story.
Metamorphosis by Mike Curry. Originally published in Thrilling Wonder Stories, August 1953. Narrated by Tom Trussel. His name was Hrlik Bray. He was a big man, and he moved slowly as if he had all the time in the world. And he had all the time, years and years behind him, years and years ahead, and the world was his, its length and breadth, its skies and seas, the solitude of night, the loneliness of day. He was eating dinner when the knowledge smashed across his mind. Tonight I am going to die. He put down his leg of Ayala and stared blankly at the plank wall across the room. That he was going to die did not disturb him. That he knew about it did. It was not whimsy that had crossed his mind. He was not given to idle speculation. It was as if a sense of precognition had suddenly developed in his intellect. It was a strange, irrevocable certainty. His gaze fell upon the half-eaten leg of Ayala, and he shrugged. A crime to let it go to waste, impending death or not. He picked it up, moved his jaw slowly around the bone. So I'm going to die. Tomorrow I'll be free. Then his eyes hardened, and his teeth tore savagely at the last bite of meat. I haven't evolved. Moving slowly because the pains had been with him all day. He called them pains, because there seemed no better word. He washed off the table and went out to the front porch of his small farmhouse on Ophiuchus 6 to sit in the twilight and smoke his pipe. He was a man of 50 Earth years, whom age had weathered and work had bent, and the strongest thing about him was his will. He had willed to remain sane in his solitary world after the tragedy so many years before, and he had made it. Just made it. He did not even talk to himself. He settled his bones in the log chair and planted his feet comfortably on the railing. He had willed that he should gaze upon this evening scene and believe it to be earth. Often he had succeeded. The same colours in the twilight, though it lasted 7 hours. A sky with a Milky Way without a moon. Gravity that made him always just a little tired. Forests and mountains and sea, beauty and peace. And Sol, a pinpoint 2,000 light-years off, with no chance of ever getting back. A living hell. He lit his pipe, filled with a native weed he'd gotten used to. There was no savour in a pipeful now, with bitterness eating at him. How could he spend his last night? There was only one way, the same as any other of the 1,000 nights before. When he died, the last of his race would disappear from the face of Asmerad, 6th planet of the sun of Fuchus. He was of Earth. O mother of comforts, Earth, in the new galactic age. It was a long way from the barbarian old atomic, almost at the fringe of prehistory. As always, when he remembered his heritage from the distant home that had given him birth, his great bowed shoulders straightened, and some of the old fire came back into his eyes. Though he did not often allow himself to think of the past, his thoughts went back, how many years ago, Earth time, to the day of triumph when Bray's ship had put down a mile away by the shore of a salt sea. 1,000 men and women with the purpose of carving out an untrodden paths, the beginning of a mighty civilization. To make a little Earth of Asmerad, as had been done on 1,000 other worlds across the galaxy, and perhaps by now, beyond. 1,000 other worlds, and here they had failed. No, they had not quite failed, not yet, not with Bray alive, not tonight, tomorrow. Suddenly restless, he rose painfully and walked down the gravel path to his flower garden. He gazed at the brilliant multicoloured web things native to the region, but the sight for once gave him no pleasure. The restlessness grew stronger. It became an urgency, at once compelling and disturbing. Urgency to do something before he died, something as important as drawing his next breath. Yet what could possibly be important to Hurlik Bray, land-bound senior captain of the space fleet, the only Earthman left on Asmerad, on the evening of his death? He looked from the flower garden across the ploughed fields of his farm and then beyond, into the broad valley that ended against the blue haze of mountains 100 miles away. For years the shimmering blue haze had symbolized the impassable wall between him and Earth. He was hemmed in, without machinery to transport himself, without weapons except for a bow and arrow he had made himself. He heard, far away, 2 trochoids thrashing aimlessly among the trees, the shrill staccato a lonely yet comforting sound. The animals, too, were almost like Earth animals. They reproduced by fission, like some of the lower forms of life on Earth. The trochoid was like an oversized wasp. The murderous Ichthysiophus was like a razorback horse, with a cry like a woman under torture. The meat-rich Ayala made him think of land-bound seals. There were other animals too, other birds, and fish in the nearby sea. Still the urgency beat at him, and without quite knowing why, he began to walk across the ploughed field to the enclosure where he kept a few Ayala to fatten. My animals might be gone, he thought anxiously. My supply of meat might fail. Hurry, his mind told him. Hurry, hurry. His steps quickened. Now the long twilight deepened, and night drifted slowly in from the far blue haze. Always, when the slow night of Asmerad began to fall, Bray felt anew the soul-wrenching loneliness. This was a twilight made for the old pleasures that over the centuries had never changed, for gathering by the campfire and singing the old songs, for the spice of well-cooked meat, for whispers in the dark and strolls through the forest, for a woman's lips on yours. And back on Earth, under the shadows of the spaceships ready to hurtle the light years across galaxy, there was laughter on the lips of man, and their hearts held room for love. With aching heart he remembered Answer, a wisp of a girl she had been, and the first of the women to die, only a month after their landing. How long would they have been married now had she lived? In this timeless world, it was his one regret that he could never know exactly. He could never celebrate their would-have-been anniversary. The day was different in length, as were the years, and he had no watch to keep track of the hours. He could never count the years she had been gone, but he knew there were many. Oh, how well he knew. He began to walk faster, and then he began to trot, and then he broke into an urgent, lumbering run, stumbling across the even furrows of the potato-like turner he had planted. And then an internal grinding shock of terrible power slammed him to the ground. He was not knocked unconscious, but lay on his face on the rich red dirt, his mind shocked into stupor. At length he shook his head, pushed heavily up with his hands, and climbed to shaky feet. He leaned against the logs of the enclosure, gathering strength. The pains were stronger now, the periodic nameless writhings inside him. Terror touched his mind, not at the pains themselves, but at their pattern over the months. Pain that was not quite pain, sensations without an earth name. They had bothered him now and then, though lately they had come more often, and this was the most terrible of all. What's been happening inside me all this time? Must be a disease, a native disease, and no doctors, no medicine left, no hospital, and no pretty nurse to hold my hand. It's beginning, he thought. Death. He had seen much of death since coming to Asmarad. Too much. First he had seen the babies born dead, the babies conceived on the way. No woman ever became pregnant on Asmarad. Nobody ever knew why. And then he had seen all the women die. Sudden deaths, painless and unexplained. The doctors could only suggest that the female physiology, complex and delicate as it was, could not adapt even to the slight changes on Asmarad. But the doctors never really knew. Their purpose on Asmarad defeated, the men planned to return to Earth, and then Bray had seen the atomic explosion that had wrecked the ship and the entire community, killing them all but Bray. And no ship was due from Earth for 100 years. My own death, Bray thought dully, wiping sweat from his face, will be different, not silent and painless and mercifully quick. He heard screaming in the distance, and his blood chilled. The Ithisiphus were near. Perhaps they would approach this farm. He would be ready if they did. Feeling stronger now, he walked to the gate to enter the enclosure. The gate was open. At first shock caught his breath, but upon examining the gate, he saw the latch had broken. He looked sharply into the enclosure for his 6 Ayala. He counted only 5. One had wandered off. No, there, far inside the enclosure. 2 intermediate-size Ayala, fissioned from the body of the other adult, were flopping about in the tall grass. He grunted with satisfaction. If the others had wandered off, it would be days before he could find them to catch others. He whistled, and the 5 adults shambled over on nimble fins. He knew he must slaughter some of them. He picked the 3 fattest. What instinct led me over here? How could I possibly have known my meat supply might be lost? Followed by the docile Ayala, he hurried back to his farmhouse, herded them inside, and closed the door. His bow and arrow would be a match for the Ithisiphus, but some instinct told him he needed even more protection. From the adjacent woodshed he got tools in lengths of stout planking and spent half an hour carefully barricading the windows. "I'd never done that in years. Why now, when I'm going to die?" Finished nailing crisscross planking of the 2 windows, he tested the barricade thoroughly for strength. Satisfied, he slaughtered the Ayala, cut up their meat, and packed it in the brine vat. Enough for a month. But why did I slaughter them now? And why 3? Why not more? Or less? The screaming sounded again, still far across the valley. He knew he must lay in more food. He had meat now, but his stock of Turner was low. There were 5 hours of twilight left, time enough to fill his bin. He was busy for 3 hours, digging Turner, though 3 times more he was knocked flat by the terrible shocks, and the pains were with him all the time. His hands had begun to shake, and his eyes would blur and dim, and he would have to rest a moment before he could see clearly again. He had begun to feel weaker. He knew the end was not far off. As he worked, his mind wandered back again to his years with the space fleet, to the other planets he'd seen where Earthmen had been able to evolve. An old word, evolution, but in the new galactic age, a new meaning. On Earth, it had taken 1 billion years for the human body to evolve into that of an intelligent biped. Now, on some of the more alien planets which imposed severe conditions on the preservation of human life, it took surprisingly less time to evolve in order to meet these conditions. An adaptability existed in the genes that had not been known before. Until it was discovered, colonization had been restricted to a handful of planets whose conditions were nearly identical to Earth's. But the discovery of the faculty of adaptable evolution had opened 1,000 worlds to Earthmen. It took centuries on some planets to evolve, slowly and painfully, and with suitable protective measures, only decades on others. It made Bray proud. Proud that the human body was capable of so much. Proud that the inheritors of the galaxy were not the Lilithii from the Ridge, or the degenerated mutations from the Hercules cluster, but Earthmen. Like those Earthmen on Thor of Beta Centaurus, whose lungs had evolved for breathing a methane atmosphere. Like those on Remus of Sirius, whose lobster-like bodies had evolved to withstand temperatures which reached 600. Like those on Betelgeuse 30, too far out from its sun for heat and light, whose eyes had atrophied over the generations and now were removed like appendices used to be removed on Earth, and whose perceptions had evolved to meet the new conditions. Or on Jupiter of the sun Deneb, where Earthmen's digestive systems had evolved to eating the metallic lichens adhering to rocks, the only native form of life. There were 1 billion Earthmen now on barren Jupiter, and only 1 on Asmerad. Why didn't we evolve before we died? But even if we could, it would have been too late. There were no women. Without a woman, his race must perish. He finished putting up his supplies and went back to the front porch to wait for the death that stalked him. He relit his pipe, his mind refreshed, the sense of urgency almost gone. But suddenly fires seared his body, and he slumped back in his chair until the racking spasm passed. Wings whirred past the porch, and the screech of a trochoid beat at his ears. He watched the furry creature land at the base of a tree in front of his farmhouse. It waddled awkwardly toward a hole Bray had not noticed before, dragging in its creepers a length of Flocko's weed, its staple diet. The bird must have been boring out the hole the past several days. As Bray watched, the bird began to close the hole in the tree from inside, with chunks of bark and dirt and moss, cemented with secretion. Now it was black night at last, and the trochoid was for the moment silent inside its tree, and Bray felt the wall of silence pressing in upon him. Answer, he thought dimly, if only we had died together. New shocks erupted inside his body, and a scream tore from his throat. A new urgency made him scramble inside the farmhouse, where he just had time to close the door and slip planks into stays made for that purpose before he fell writhing to the floor. There came a moment of peace between the shocks. I was thinking of Answer when it struck. Answer? My wife. Funny, I can't seem to think. Must be in a daze. I remember Answer all right. What was Answer, anyhow? I know a woman. They look like earthmen, bipeds. I think they have intellects. Must be non-human, like the Lilithae. From the tree outside he heard the trochoid's muffled screeches. He knew it was the standard routine of the asexual bird for fissioning. When an old trochoid's instinct told it that it was about to die, it found a breeding place safe from the Ithisippos, supplied it with food, barricaded itself inside, and then fissioned into two nearly grown, mindless trochoids. The food and the protection afforded by their parents would keep the trochoids alive till instinct took hold, and they could break free into the world outside. Bray forgot about the trochoid as his neck suddenly snapped, and it became impossible to breathe, and he felt his body being rent asunder as if something were trying to tear its way out of him. And before he died, he had one bitter final thought. I deserve to die. On Asmerad, we never evolved. And after he died, the two naked humanoid creatures sprang to their feet to stare mindlessly at one another.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. Hold Onto Your Body by Richard O. Lewis. Originally published in Imagination Stories of Science and Fantasy, October 1953. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Fidwell, I said, why don't you go lose yourself? He stared at me uncomprehendingly for a full 3 seconds. Then a glimmer of understanding leaped into his beady little eyes, and he got up from the chair before my desk and started happily toward the outer door of the office. "Okay, Mr. Nelson," he said over a thin shoulder. "Just whatever you say." "Better still," I amended, tapping the glass top of my desk with manicured nails. "Go shoot yourself." He nodded blithely. "Just as you say, TJ, just as you say." He always called me TJ when he felt that I was giving him a measure of attention. "Wait," I said, as he reached the door. "Do you by any chance own a gun?" He turned, a frown spreading between his mousy brows. "No," he said slowly, "I don't." Then he brightened. "But I could purchase one." "Fine," I said, tossing him a bill. "Buy a couple of bullets for it, too." He caught the money, smiled, nodded, and left, closing the door softly and respectfully behind him. Humming a merry little tune, I turned to the papers upon my desk. The partnership contract between James Fidwell and T.J. Nelson. If one of the partners should die from any cause, the other partner would become sole owner of the Remy Company. They seemed quite in order. I shuffled them into a neat pile and cut an intricate little dance step on my way through the files with them. The partnership was soon to reach a happy culmination. Suicide has it all over murder, you know. No silly questions from the police, no mess to clean up, no body to get rid of. The relatives usually take care of all that. No bother at all, really. I skipped back to the desk, flipped up the telephone, and began poking a finger into the little holes in the dial. "Mr. Pasquamine," I chimed, after hearing the faint click at the other end of the wire. "Yes?" "This is TJ," I said, chummily. "You still own that block of floating stock in the Remy Company, don't you?" "Yes." "Fine, fine," I complimented. "Bring it over to my office as soon as possible. And by the way," I added, casually, "have it transferred to my name, you know." "Yes." He was in my office in less than an hour, his fat hulk sweating and panting in the chair before my desk, the heavy lids drooping over his black eyes. The stocks were piled neatly before me. I thumbed through them. They seemed to be quite in order. I skipped across the room to the files with them. "Pasquamine," I said, returning to my desk and handing him a cheap cigar. "Do you by a chance own a gun?" He shook his fat head. "No." "Do you have at home, perchance, a rope?" I glanced at his obese body. "A good stout one?" "No." "A knife, perhaps? A good sharp one?" His oily face beamed quickly. "Ah, Mr. Nelson, that I have. Sharp for the salami." He kissed his thick fingers and made a flipping motion in the air with them. "Sharp for the good big salami." "Excellent," I nodded quick approbation. "Go home and cut your throat with it." He pushed his hulk up from the chair and walked toward the door. "And don't bother about coming back to the office afterwards," I admonished. He paused, hand on the knob, and turned. Then his round face lighted up. "Ah, Mr. Nelson," he chuckled, "you make with a joke." "Sure," I smiled. "And now you go home and make with a knife." That was the last time I saw Pasquamine. Except at the funeral, of course. He made a lovely corpse, considering everything. It was the day following the funeral when there came a gentle tapping at my office door. "Come in," I said, tossing the half-finished bottle of gin back into the lower drawer. They didn't bother about opening the door. They just crawled under it. A moment later, they had slithered across the floor, had wiggled their way up to the top of my desk, and had flattened out upon its polished surface in complete pseudopod relaxation. Giff and Gil, my two very good friends. "Sorry, boys," I said after we had exchanged the usual amenities, "that I had to get rid of your symbiotics in such a messy fashion. But business is business, you know, and I felt that the time was right." Giff shrugged gelatinously. "I was getting tired of occupying Fidwell anyway," he vibrated. "Regular old pussyfoot. Never had no fun." Gil burped resoundingly in the middle. "I hope the next body I get doesn't turn out to be another wine-guzzling garlic-eater." A tremor ran through him. "It upsets me frightfully." "Time and the rising tide of accidents will tell," I soothed. "I'm cold," trembled Giff, "since I ain't got nobody to keep me warm." "You might try my secretary," I offered playfully. "There's a body for you." "You know I can't," he vibrated. "She ain't even dead yet." "Nearest thing to it," I commented. "This side of the precinct morgue." That brought a shake of mirth from Gil, who really has a truly remarkable sense of humour. Giff, ignoring the levity, slid over to the little intercom box at one side of the desk, crawled in through one of the slits, curled up, and promptly went to sleep. It seems that Fidwell, along with his other faults, had also been a sufferer of insomnia. "I suppose," I said to Gil conversationally, "you'll be wanting a new body now." "Not necessarily. Not right away." He edged away from the blotter my desk fan was blowing in his direction. "Want to wait." A burp nearly flipped him again, until these garlic fumes effervesced more completely from my system. "It worked out wonderfully well, though," I said, "even though you did have to put up with the garlic for a while." I brought out the gin bottle from the lower drawer. It was certainly fortunate that Giff was on hand to occupy Fidwell just after his wife murdered him. I unstoppered the bottle and raised it to my lips. To Fidwell, departed partner and erstwhile owner of the Remy Company. And the joke wasn't Mrs. Fidwell, sparkled Gill's sense of humour. Just imagine seeing her husband up walking around, hale and hearty, just a half-hour after she had throttled the life out of him with her own 2 hands. No wonder she had to be locked up, I chuckled, pouring a few drops of gin on the polished glass near my companion. My getting the body of Pasquamine, owner of the floating stock, wasn't so bad either, he reminded me, isolating a drop of gin and flowing around it. I admitted the fact. He nearly crushed me too when he tumbled, Gill reminded. I'd been following him 2 weeks, waiting for his fat heart to do a flopperoo. We both laughed. I took another drink, and Gill osmosed a nip. Finally, I leaned across the desk. "Listen, Gill," I said, coldly serious. "Now that this little deal is over, how would you like to get in on something else? Something really big?" He instantly became all ears. Naturally, only a pseudopod can do it. "After I sell out Remy," I continued, "we'll have ample funds. So, if we moved over to Washington, D.C., if you and Giff could get in touch with a couple tottering congressmen who are about ready to depart from this vale of tears." Gill caught on immediately. "TJ," he complimented, "you've got something." He fell silent, and I knew he was letting the gin and the thought trickle through him, savouring both from various angles. Then he vibrated dreamily. "I've always wanted to be a congressman, or a cabinet member, or," his vibration dropped to little more than a whisper, "or a president." "Sorry," I said, "but I believe he's already possessed." Gill flowed around another drop of gin. "Oh well," he said, dismissing the ambition. "Guess he doesn't have much to say about things anyway." Then he brightened. "But there are some mighty fine bureaus and departments there. We could wiggle our way into one of those. A few $1 million here and there wouldn't be missed." "Attaboy! I'll take you and Giff over to Washington in the morning. Then I'll come back here and dispose of the business while the 2 of you are getting established." It sounded like a good idea. "Within a few years, we'll be rolling in the filthy stuff." I poured a few more drops of gin on the glass top, then raised the bottle. "Here's to happy days in the Pentagon," I toasted. Our spirits were soon soaring to great heights, and, as usual under such circumstances, Gill began talking about the good old days, when you could pick up a likely corpse almost anywhere, any time. "Used to be so much simpler then," he commented, flowing around one of the fresh drops. "Now you have to beat the embalmer," he chuckled. "Fairly close race at times, too. But it keeps one on one's pseudo-toes, so to speak." A combined burp and hiccup nearly flopped him off the desk. After he had regained his equilibrium, we spent an enjoyable half-hour talking of cadavers, funeral homes, and the comparative merits of inhabiting youthful or wealthy bodies, and other delightfully stimulating subjects. Then we began to sing songs, old and new. We had finished the chorus of "We Have All the Dough of Remy" for the 3rd time, and were just getting warmed up on an extemporization of "We'll Carry On in the Pentagon," when the office door flew suddenly open and 2 federal boys stepped in, followed by my stupid-looking secretary. They came quickly to the desk. One of them grabbed a handful of Gill with one hand and pointed a gun at me with the other. "Just stay it you are," the officer cautioned. My dumb secretary stared at me with round, innocent eyes. "I couldn't help hearing everything you said, Mr. Nelson," she chirped, half apologetically. "Your intercom box was open. Must be a short in it somewhere, or a loose connection." The other officer picked up the little box and shook it. A surprised Giff fell out from between the slats. They have Giff and Gill in a little bottle now, tightly stoppered and ready for shipment back home to Venus. They'll be placed on the next spaceship heading out. There is a stupid terrestrial law, you know, which makes it mandatory that all Venusians be apprehended on sight or extracted from any body they may be occupying and sent back to Venus in all possible haste. And so I shall soon be extracted from the body of T.J. Nelson, and his neck will bend double in the middle again, just the way it was when I found him shortly after his accidents. Then, in a little bottle of my own, I shall accompany Giff and Gill homeward. But don't worry, I'll be back. I'll be back just as soon as I can hitch a ride on a returning spaceboat. So take good care of yourself, my friend, and don't catch pneumonia or step in front of a truck or anything like that. Until I return.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. The Wind People by Marion Zimmer Bradley. Originally published in Worlds of If Science Fiction, February 1959. Narrated by Tom Trussel. It had been a long layover for the Starhome's crew, hunting heavy elements for fuel. 8 months, on an idyllic green paradise of a planet, a soft, windy, whispering world, inhabited only by trees and winds. But in the end, it presented its own unique problem. Specifically, it presented Captain Merrihew with the problem of Robin, male, father unknown, who had been born the day before, and a month prematurely, to Dr. Helen Murray. Merrihew found her lying abed in the laboratory shelter, pale and calm, with a child beside her. The little shelter, constructed roughly of green planks, looked out on the clearing which the Starhome had used as a base of operations during the layover, a beautiful place at the bottom of a wide valley, in the curve of a broad, deep-flowing river. The crew, tired of being ship-bound, had built 6 such huts and shacks in these 8 months. Merrihew glared down at Helen. He snorted. "This is a fine situation. You, of all the people in the whole damn crew, the ship's doctor. It's... Inarticulate with rage, he fell back on a ridiculously inadequate phrase. "It's criminal carelessness." "I know," Helen Murray, too young and far too lovely for a ship's officer on a 10-year cruise, still looked weak and white, and her voice was a gentle shadow of its crisp self. "I'm afraid 4 years in space made me careless." Merrihew brooded, looking down at her. Something about ship gravity conditions, while not affecting potency, made conception impossible. No child had ever been conceived in space, and none ever would. On planet layovers, the effect wore off very slowly. Only after 3 months aground had Dr. Murray started routine administration of antiseptin to the 22 women of the crew, herself included. At that time, she had been still unaware that she herself was already carrying a child. Outside, the leafy forest whispered and rustled, and Merrihew knew Helen had forgotten his existence again. The day-old child was tucked up in one of her rolled coveralls at her side. To Merrihew, he looked like a skinned monkey, but Helen's eyes smouldered as her hands moved gently over the tiny round head. He stood and listened to the winds, and said at random, "These shacks will fall to pieces in another month. It doesn't matter. We'll have taken off by then." Dr. Shaolin came into the shack, an angular woman of 35. She said, "Company, Helen? Well, it's about time. Here, let me take Robin." Helen said in weak protest, "You're spoiling me, Lin." "It will do you good," Shaolin returned. Merrihew, in a sudden surge of fury and frustration, exploded. "Damn it, Lynn, you're making it all worse. He'll die when we go into overdrive, you know as well as I do." Helen sat up, clutching Robin protectively. "Are you proposing to drown him like a kitten?" "Helen, I'm not proposing anything. I'm stating a fact." "But it's not a fact. He won't die in overdrive because he won't be aboard when we go into overdrive." Merrihew looked at Lynn helplessly, but his face softened. "Shall we put him to sleep and bury him here?" The woman's face turned white. "No!" she cried in passionate protest, and Lynn bent to disengage her frantic grip. "Helen, you'll hurt him. Put him down. There." Merrihew looked down at her, troubled, and said, "We can't just abandon him to die slowly, Helen." "Who says I'm going to abandon him?" Merrihew asked slowly. "Are you planning to desert?" he added after a minute. "There's a chance he'll survive. After all, his very birth was against all medical precedent. Maybe—" "Captain," Helen sounded desperate, "even drugged, no child under 10 has ever endured the shift into hyperspace drive. A newborn would die in seconds." She clasped Robin to her again and said, "It's the only way. You have Lynn for a doctor. Reynolds can handle my collateral duties. This planet is uninhabited. The climate is mild. We couldn't possibly starve." Her face, so gentle, was suddenly like rock. "Enter my death in the log if you want to." Merrihew looked from Helen to Lynn and said, "Helen, you're insane." She said, "Even if I'm sane now, I wouldn't be long if I had to abandon Robin." The wild note had died out of her voice, and she spoke rationally but inflexibly. "Captain Merrihew, to get me aboard the Starhome, you will have to have me drugged or taken by force. I promise you I won't go any other way. And if you do that, and if Robin is left behind or dies in overdrive, just so you will have my services as a doctor, then I solemnly swear that I will kill myself at the first opportunity." "My God," said Merrihew, "you are insane." Helen gave a very tiny shrug. "Do you want a mad woman aboard?" Shaolin said quietly, "Captain, I don't see any other way. We'd have had to arrange it that way if Helen had actually died in childbirth. Of two unsatisfactory solutions, we must choose the least harmful." And Merrihew knew that he had no real choice. "I still think you're both crazy," he blustered, but it was surrender, and Helen knew it. 10 days after the Starhome took off, young Colin Reynolds, technician, committed suicide by the messy procedure of slicing his jugular artery, which, in zero gravity, distributed several quarts of blood in big round globules all over his cabin. He left an incoherent note. Merrihew put the note in the disposal, and Shaolin put the blood in the ship's blood bank for surgery, and they hushed it up as an accident. But Merrihew had the unpleasant feeling that the layover on the green and windy planet was going to become a legend, spread in whispers by the crew. And it did, but that is another story. Robin was 2 years old when he first heard the voices in the wind. He pulled at his mother's arm and crooned softly in imitation. "What is it, lovey?" "Pretty," he crooned again to the distant murmuring sound. Helen smiled vaguely and patted the round cheek. Robin, his infant imagination suddenly distracted, said, "Hungry, Robin, hungry. Berries." "Berries after you eat," Helen promised absently, and picked him up. Robin tugged at her arm. "Mummy pretty too." She laughed, a rosy and smiling young Diana. She was happy on the solitary planet. They lived quite comfortably in one of the larger shacks, and only a little frown line between her eyes bore witness to the terror which had closed down on her in the first months, when every new day had been some new struggle against weakness against unfamiliar sounds, against loneliness and dread. Nights when she lay wakeful, sweating with terror, while the winds rose and fell again, and her imagination gave them voices. Bleak days when she wandered dazedly around the shack or stared moodily at Robin. There had been moments, only fleeting, and penanced with hours of shame and regret, when she thought that even the horror of losing Robin in those first days would have been less than the horror of spending the rest of her life alone here, when she had wondered why Merryhugh had not realized that she was unbalanced and forced her to go with him. By now, Robin would have been only a moment's painful memory. Still not strong, knowing she had to be strong for Robin, or he would die as surely as if she had abandoned him, she had spent the first months in a somnambulistic dream. Sometimes he had walked for days at a time in that dream. She would wake to find food that she could not remember gathering. Somehow, pervasive, the dream voices had taken over. The whispering winds had been full of voices and even hands. She had fallen ill and lain for days sick and delirious, and had heard a voice which hardly seemed to be her own, saying that if she died, the wind voices would care for Robin. And then the shock and irrationality of that had startled her out of delirium, agonized and trembling, and she had pulled herself upright and cried out, "No!" And the shimmer of eyes and voices had faded again into vague echoes, until there was only the stir of sunlight on the leaves, and Robin, chubby and naked, kicking in the sunlight, cooing with his hands outstretched to the rustle of leaves and shadows. She had known then that she had to get well. She had never heard the wind voices again, and her crisp scientific mind rejected the fanciful theory that if she only believed in the wind voices, she would see their forms and hear their words clearly. And she rejected them so thoroughly that when she heard them speak, she shut them away from her mind, and after a time heard them no longer, except in restless dreams. By now she had accepted the isolation and the beauty of their world, and begun to make a happy life for Robin. For lack of other occupation last summer, though the winter was mild and there was no lack of fruits and roots even then, Helen had patiently snared male and female of small animals like rabbits, and now she had a pen of them. They provided a change of diet, and after a few smelly, unsuccessful experiments, she had devised a way to supple their fur pelts. She made no effort at gardening, though when Robin was older she might try that. For the moment, it was enough that they were healthy and safe and protected. Robin was listening again. Helen bent her ear, sharpened by the silence, but heard only the rustle of wind and leaves, saw only falling brightness along a silvered tree trunk. Wind, when there were no branches stirring? Ridiculous, she said sharply, then snatched up the baby boy and squeezed him before hoisting him astride her hip. "Mummy doesn't mean you, Robin. Let's look for berries." But soon she realized that his head was tipped back, and that he was listening again, to some sound she could not hear. On what she said was Robin's 5th birthday, Helen had made a special bed for him in another room of the building. He missed the warmth of Helen's body and the comforting sound of her breathing, for Robin, since birth, had been a wakeful child. Yet, on the first night alone, Robin felt curiously freed. He did something he had never dared do before for fear of waking Helen. He slipped from his bed and stood in the doorway, looking into the forest. The forest was closer to the doorway now. Robin could fuzzily remember when the clearing had been wider. Now slowly, beyond the garden patch which Helen kept cleared, the underbrush and saplings were growing back, and even what Robin called the burned place was covered with new sparse grass. Robin was accustomed to being alone during the day. Even in his first year, Helen had had to leave him alone, securely fastened in the house, or inside a little tight fenced yard, but he was not used to being alone at night. Far off in the forest, he could hear the whispers of the other people. Helen said there were no other people, but Robin knew better, because he could hear their voices on the wind, like fragments of the songs Helen sang at bedtime, and sometimes he could almost see them in the shadowy spots. Once when Helen had been sick, a long time ago, and Robin had run helplessly from the fenced yard to the inside room and back again, hungry and dirty and furious because Helen only slept on the bed with her eyes closed, rousing up now and then to whimper like he did when he fell down and skinned his knee. The winds and voices had come into the very house. Robin had hazy memories of soothing voices, of hands that touched him more softly than Helen's hands, but he could not quite remember. Now that he could hear them so clearly, he would go and find the other people, and then, if Helen was sick again, there would be someone else to play with him and look after him. He thought gleefully, "Won't Helen be surprised?" and darted off across the clearing. Helen woke, roused not by a sound, but by a silence. She no longer heard Robin's soft breaths from the alcove, and after a moment she realized something else. The winds were silent. Perhaps, she thought, a storm was coming. Some change in air pressure could cause this stillness. But Robin... She tiptoed to the alcove. As she had suspected, his bed was empty. Where could he be? In the clearing? With a storm coming? She slid her feet into hand-made sandals and ran outside, her quivering call ringing out through the silent forest. "Robin! Oh, Robin!" Silence. And far away, a little ominous whisper. And for the first time since that first frightening year of loneliness, she felt lost, deserted in an alien world. She ran across the clearing, looking around wildly, trying to decide which way he could have wandered. Into the forest? What if he had strayed toward the river bank? There was a place where the bank crumbled away, down toward the rapids. Her throat closed convulsively, and her call was almost a shriek. "Oh, Robin! Robin, darling, Robin!" She ran through the paths worn by their feet, hearing snatches of rustle, wind and leaves suddenly vocal in the cold moonlight around her. It was the first time since the spaceship left them that Helen had ventured out into the night of their world. She called again, her voice cracking in panic. "Robin!" A sudden stray gleam revealed a glint of white, and a child stood in the middle of the path. Helen gasped with relief and ran to snatch up her son, then fell back in dismay. It was not Robin who stood there. The child was naked, about a head shorter than Robin, and female. There was something curious about the bare and gleaming flesh, as if she could see the child only in the full flush of the moonlight. A round, almost expressionless face was surrounded by a mass of colourless streaming hair, the exact colour of the moonlight. Helen's audible gasp startled her to a stop. She shut her eyes convulsively, and when she opened them, the path was black and empty, and Robin was running down the track toward her. Helen caught him up with a strangled cry and ran, clasping him to her breast, back down the path to their shack. Inside she barred the door and laid Robin down in her own bed and threw herself down, shivering, too shaken to speak, too shaken to scold him, curiously afraid to question. "I had a hallucination," she told herself. "A hallucination, another dream, a dream." A dream, like the other dream. She dignified it to herself as the dream, because it was not like any other dream she had ever had. She had dreamed it first before Robin's birth, and had been ashamed to speak of it to Shaolin, fearing the common-sense skepticism of the older woman. On their 10th night on the green planet, the star home was a dim recollection now, when Merryhugh's scientists had been convinced that the little world was safe, without wild beasts or diseases or savage natives. The crew had requested permission to camp in the valley clearing beside the river. Permission granted, they had gone apart in couples almost as usual, and even those who had no enduring liaison at the moment had found a partner for the night. It must have been that night. Colin Reynolds was 2 years younger than Helen, and their attachment, enduring over a few months of ship time, was based less on mutual passion than a sort of boyish need in him, a sort of impersonal feminine solicitude in Helen. All her affairs had been like that, companionable, comfortable, but never passionate. Curiously enough, Helen was a woman capable of passion, of great depths of devotion, but no man had ever roused it, and now no man ever would. Only Robin's birth had touched her deeply pent emotions. But that night, when Colin Reynolds was sleeping, Helen stayed restlessly awake, hearing the unquiet stirring of wind on the leaves. After a time, she wandered down to the water's edge, staying a cautious distance from the shore, for the cliff crumbled dangerously, and stretched herself out to listen to the wind voices. And after a time she fell asleep, and had the dream, which was to return to her again and again. Helen thought of herself as a scientist without room for fantasies, and that was why she called it, fiercely, a dream. A dream born of some undiagnosed conflict in her. Even to herself, Helen would not recall it in full. There had been a man, and to her it seemed that he was part of the green and windy world, and he had found her sleeping by the river. Even in her drowsy state, Helen had suspected that perhaps one of the other crew members, like herself, sleepless and drawn to the shining water, had happened upon her there. Such things were not impossible, manners and mores being what they were among starship crews. But to her, half dreaming, there had been some strangeness about him, which prevented her from seeing him too clearly even in the brilliant green moonlight. No dream and no man had ever seemed so living to her, and it was her fierce rationalization of the dream which kept her silent months later, when she discovered, to her horror and secret despair, that she was with child. She had felt that she would lose the haze and secret delight of the dream if she openly acknowledged that Colin had fathered her child. But at first, in the cool green morning that followed, she had not been at all sure it was a dream. Seeing only sunlight and leaves, she had held back from speaking, not wanting ridicule. Could she have asked each man of the star home, "Was it you who came to me last night?" Because if it was not, there are other men on this world, men who cannot be clearly seen even by moonlight. Severely she reminded herself, Merryhugh's men had pronounced the world uninhabited, and uninhabited it must be. 5 years later, hugging her sleeping son close, Helen remembered the dream, examined the content of a fantasy, and once again, shivering, repeated, "I had a hallucination. It was only a dream, because I was alone." When Robin was 14 years old, Helen told him the story of his birth and of the ship. He was a tall, silent boy, strong and hardy, but not talkative. He heard the story almost in silence, and looked at Helen for a long time in silence afterward. He finally said in a whisper, "You could have died. You gave up a lot for me, Helen, didn't you?" He knelt and took her face in his hands. She smiled and drew a little away from him. Why are you looking at me like that, Robin?" The boy could not put instant words to his thoughts. Emotions were not in his vocabulary. Helen had taught him everything she knew, but she had always concealed her feelings from her son. He asked at last, "Why did my father stay with you?" "I don't suppose it entered his head," Helen said. "He was needed on the ship. Losing me was bad enough." Robin said passionately, "I'd have stayed." The woman found herself laughing. "Well, you did stay, Robin." He asked, "Am I like my father?" Helen looked gravely at her son, trying to see the half-forgotten features of young Reynolds in the boy's face. No, Robin did not look like Colin Reynolds, nor like Helen herself. She picked up his hand in hers. Despite his robust health, Robin never tanned. His skin was pearly pale, so that in the green sunlight it blended into the forest almost invisible. His hand lay in Helen's palm like a shadow. She said at last, "No, nothing like him. But under this sun, that's to be expected." Robin said confidently, "I'm like the other people." "The ones on the ship, they—" "No," Robin interrupted. "You always said when I was older you'd tell me about the other people. I mean the other people here, the ones in the woods, the ones you can't see." Helen stared at the boy in blank disbelief. "What do you mean? There are no other people, just us." Then she recalled that every imaginative child invents playmates. "Alone," she thought. "Robin's always alone, no other children. No wonder he's a little strange." She said quietly, "You dreamed it, Robin." The boy only stared at her in bleak, blank alienation. "You mean," he said, "you can't hear them either?" He got up and walked out of the hut. Helen called, but he didn't turn back. She ran after him, catching at his arm, stopping him almost by force. She whispered, "Robin, Robin, tell me what you mean. There isn't anyone here. Once or twice I thought I had seen something by moonlight, only it was a dream. Please, Robin, please."
"If it's only a dream, why are you frightened?" Robin asked, through a curious constriction in his throat. "If they've never hurt you—" No, they had never hurt her. Even if her long-ago dream, one of them had come to her. "And the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair." A scrap of memory from a vanished life on another world sang in Helen's thoughts. She looked up at the pale, impatient face of her son and swallowed hard. Her voice was husky when she spoke. "Did I ever tell you about rationalization? When you want something to be true so much that you can make it sound right to yourself." "Couldn't that also happen to something you wanted not to be true?" Robin retorted with a mutinous curl of his mouth. Helen would not let go of his arm. She begged, "Robin, no. You'll only waste your life and break your heart looking for something that doesn't exist." The boy looked down into her shaken face, and suddenly a new emotion welled up in him, and he dropped to his knees beside her and buried his face against her breast. He whispered, "Helen, I'll never leave you. I'll never do anything you don't want me to do. I don't want anyone but you." And for the first time in many years, Helen broke into wild and uncontrollable crying, without knowing why she wept. Robin did not speak again of his quest in the forest. For many months he was quiet and subdued, staying near the clearing, hovering near Helen for days at a time, then disappearing into the forest at dusk. He heard the winds numbly, deaf to their promise and their call. Helen, too, was quiet and withdrawn, feeling Robin's alienation through his submissive mood. She found herself speaking to him sharply for being always underfoot, yet, on the rare days when he vanished into the forest and did not return until after sunset,
She felt a restless unease that set her wandering the paths herself, not following him, but simply uneasy unless she knew he was within call. Once, in the shadows just before sunset, she thought she saw a man moving through the trees, and for an instant, as he turned toward her, she saw that he was naked. She had seen him only for a second or two, and after he had slipped between the shadows again, common sense told her it was Robin. She was vaguely shocked and annoyed. She firmly intended to speak to him, perhaps to scold him for running about naked and slipping away like that. Then, in a sort of remote embarrassment, she forbore to mention it. But after that, she kept out of the forest. Robin had been vaguely aware of her surveillance and knew when it ceased, but he did not give up his own pointless rambles, although even to himself he no longer spoke of searching, or of any dreamlike inhabitants of the woods. At times it still seemed that some shadow concealed a half-seen form, and the distant murmur grew into a voice that mocked him, a white arm, the shadow of a face, until he lifted his head and stared straight at it. One evening toward twilight he saw a sudden shimmer in the trees, and he stood fixedly as the stray glint resolved itself first into a white face with shadowy eyes, then into a translucent flicker of bare arms, and then into the form of a woman, arrested for an instant with a hand on the bole of a tree. In the shadowy spot, filled only with the last ray of a cloudy sunset, she was very clear, not cloudy or unreal, but so distinct that he could see even a small smudge or bramble scratch on her shoulder, and a fallen leaf tangled in her colourless hair. Robin, paralyzed, watched her pause, and turn, and smile, and then she melted into the shadows. He stood with his heart pounding for a second after she had gone, then whirled, bursting with the excitement of his discovery, and ran down the path toward home. Suddenly he stopped short, the world tilting and reeling, and fell on his face in a bed of dry leaves. He was still ignorant of the nature of the emotion in him. He felt only intolerable misery, and the conviction that he must never, never speak to Helen of what he had seen or felt. He lay there, his burning face pressed into the leaves, unaware of the rising wind, the little flurry of blown leaves, the growing darkness and distant thunder. At last an icy spatter of rain aroused him, and cold, numbed, he made his way slowly homeward. Over his head the boughs creaked woodenly, and Robin, under the driving whips of the rain, felt the tumult only echoed his own voiceless agony. He was drenched by the time he pushed the door of the shack open, and stumbled blindly toward the fire, only hoping that Helen would be sleeping. But she started up from beside the hearth they had built together last summer. "Robin?" Deathly weary, the boy snapped, "Who else would it be?" Helen didn't answer. She came to him, a small, swift-moving figure in the firelight, and drew him into the warmth. She said, almost humbly, "I was afraid. The storm. Robin, you're all wet. Come to the fire and dry out." Robin yielded, his twitching nerves partly soothed by her voice. How tiny Helen is, he thought, and I can remember that she used to carry me around on one arm. Now she hardly comes to my shoulder. She brought him food, and he ate wolfishly, listening to the steady pouring rain, uncomfortable under Helen's watching eyes. Before his own eyes there was the clear memory of the woman in the wood, and so vivid was Robin's imagination, heightened by loneliness, and undiluted by any random impressions, that it seemed to him Helen must see her too. And when she came to stand beside him, the picture grew so keen in his thoughts that he actually pulled himself free of her. The next day dawned grey and still, beaten with long needles of rain. They stayed indoors by the smouldering fire, Robin, half sick and feverish from his drenching, sprawled by the hearth, too indolent to move, watching Helen's comings and goings about the room, not realizing why the sight of her slight, quick form against the grey light filled him with such pain and melancholy. The storm lasted 4 days. Helen exhausted her household tasks and sat restlessly thumbing through the few books she knew by heart. They had allowed her to remove all her personal possessions, all the things she had chosen on a forgotten and faraway earth for a 10-year star cruise. For the first time in years, Helen was thinking again of the life, the civilization she had thrown away, for Robin, who had been a pink scrap in the circle of her arm, and now lay sullen on the hearth, not speaking, aimlessly whittling a stick with a knife, found discarded in a heap of rubbish from the star-home, which was his dearest possession. Helen felt slow horror closing in on her. What world, what heritage did I give him in my madness? This world has driven us both insane. Robin and I are both a little mad by Earth's standards. And when I die, and I will die first, what then? At that moment Helen would have given her life to believe in his old dream of strange people in the wood. She flung her book restlessly away, and Robin, as if waiting for that signal, sat upright and said almost eagerly, "Helen!" Grateful that he had broken the silence of days, she gave him an encouraging smile. "I've been reading your books," he began, diffidently, "and I read about the sun you came from. It's different from this one. Suppose if there were actually a kind of people here, and something in this light, or in your eyes, made them invisible to you." Helen said, "Have you been seeing them again?" He flinched at her ironical tone, and she asked somewhat more gently, "It's a theory, Robin, but it wouldn't explain, then, why you see them." "Maybe I'm more used to this light," he said gropingly. "And anyway, you said you thought you'd seen them and thought it was only a dream." Halfway between exasperation and a deep pity, Helen found herself arguing. "If these other people of yours really exist, why haven't they made themselves known in 16 years? The eagerness with which he answered was almost frightening. "I think they only come out at night. They're what your book calls a primitive civilization." He spoke the words he had read, but never heard, with an odd hesitation. "They're not really a civilization at all, I think. They're like part of the woods." "A forest people," Helen mused, impressed in spite of herself. "And nocturnal. It's always moonlight or dusky when you see them." "Then you do believe me? Oh, Helen!" Robin cried, and suddenly found himself pouring out the story of what he had seen in incoherent words, concluding, "And by daylight I can hear them, but I can't see them. Helen, Helen, you have to believe it now. You have to let me try to find them and learn to talk to them." Helen listened with a sinking heart. She knew they should not discuss it now, when 5 days of enforced housebound proximity had set their nerves and tempers on edge. But some unknown tension hurled her sharp words at Robin. "You saw a woman, and I, a man. These things are only dreams. Do I have to explain more to you?" Robin flung his knife suddenly aside. "You're so blind, so stubborn." "I think you are feverish again." Helen rose to go. He said wrathfully, "You treat me like a child." "Because you act like one, with your fairy tales of women in the wind." Suddenly Robin's agony overflowed, and he caught at her, holding her around the knees, clinging to her as he had not done since he was a small child, his words stumbling and rushing over one another. "Helen, Helen, darling, don't be angry with me," he begged, and caught her in a blind embrace that pulled her off her feet. She had never guessed how strong he was, but he seemed very like a little boy, and she hugged him quickly as he began to cover her face with childish kisses. "Don't cry, Robin, my baby. It's all right," she murmured, kneeling close to him. Gradually, the wildness of his passionate crying abated. She touched his forehead with her cheek to see if it were heated with fever, and he reached up and held her there. Helen let him lie against her shoulder, feeling that perhaps, after the violence of his outburst, he should fall asleep, and she was half asleep herself when a sudden shock of realization darted through her. Quickly she tried to free herself from Robin's entangling arms. "Robin, let me go!" He clung to her, not understanding. "Don't let go of me, Helen, darling. Stay here beside me," he begged, and pressed a kiss into her throat. Helen, her blood icing over, realized that unless she freed herself very quickly now, she would be fighting against a strong, aroused young man, not clearly aware of what he was doing. She took refuge in the sharp maternal note of 10 years ago, almost vanished in the closer, more equal companionship of the time between. "No, Robin, stop it at once. Do you hear?" Automatically he let her go, and she rolled quickly away out of his reach and got to her feet. Robin, too intelligent to be unaware of her anger and too naive to know its cause, suddenly dropped his head and wept, wholly unstrung. "Why are you angry?" he blurted out. "I was only loving you." And at the phrase of the 5-year-old child, Helen felt her throat would burst with its ache. She managed to choke out, "I'm not angry, Robin. We'll talk about this later, I promise." And then, her old control vanishing, turned and fled precipitately into the pouring rain. She plunged through the familiar woods for a long time, in a daze of unthinking misery. She did not even fully realize that she was sobbing and muttering aloud, "No, no, no, no." She must have wandered for several hours. The rain had stopped, and the darkness was lifting before she began to grow calmer and to think more clearly. She had been blind, not to foresee this day when Robin was a child. Only if her child had been a daughter could it have been avoided. Or she was shocked at the hysterical sound of her own laughter. If Colin had stayed, and they had raised a family like Adam and Eve. But what now? Robin was 16. She was not yet 40. Helen caught at vanishing memories of society, taboos so deeply rooted that for Helen they were instinctual and impregnable. Yet for Robin, nothing existed except this little patch of forest and Helen herself, the only person in his world, more specifically at the moment, the only woman in his world. So much, she thought bitterly, for instinct. But have I the right to begin this all over again? Worse, have I the right to deny its existence, and when I die, leave Robin alone? She had stumbled and paused for breath, realizing that she had wandered in circles, and that she was at a familiar point on the riverbank, which she had avoided for 16 years. On the heels of this realization, she had become aware that the only second time in memory, the winds were wholly stilled. Her eyes, swollen with crying, ached as she tried to pierce the gloom of the mist, lilac-tinted, with the approaching sunrise which hung around the water. Through the dispersing mist she made out, dimly, the form of a man. He was tall, and his pale skin shone with misty white colours. Helen sat frozen, her mouth open, and for the space of several seconds he looked down at her without moving. His eyes, dark splashes in the pale face, had an air of infinite sadness and compassion, and she thought his lips moved in speech, but she heard only a thin familiar rustle of wind. Behind him, mere flickers, she seemed to make out the ghosts of other faces, tips of fingers of invisible hands, eyes, the outline of a woman's breast, the curve of a child's foot. For a minute, in Helen's weary, numbed state, all her defences went down, and she thought, "Then I'm not mad, and it wasn't a dream, and Robin isn't Reynolds' son at all. His father was this, one of these, and they've been watching me and Robin. Robin has seen them. He doesn't know he's one of them, but they know. They know, and I've kept Robin from them all these 16 years. The man took 2 steps toward her, the translucent body shifting to a dozen colours before her blurred eyes. His face had a curious familiarity. Familiarity! And in a sudden spasm of terror, Helen thought, "I'm going mad! It's Robin! It's Robin!" His hand was actually outstretched but to touch her when her scream cut icy lashes through the forest, stirring wild echoes in the wind voices, and she whirled and ran blindly toward the treacherous crumbling bank. Behind her came steps, a voice, a cry. Robin, the strange dryad man, she could not guess. The horror of incest, the son, the father, the lover suddenly melting into one, overwhelmed her reeling brain, and she fled insanely to the brink. She felt a masculine hand actually gripping her shoulder. She might have been pulled back even then, but she twisted free blindly, shrieking, "No, Robin, no, no!" and flung herself down the steep bank, to slip and hurl downward and whirl around in the raging current to spinning oblivion and death. Many years later, Merrihew, grown old in the space service, falsified a log entry to send his ship for a little while into the orbit of the tiny green planet he had named Robin's World. The old buildings had fallen into rotted timbers, and Merrihew quartered the little world for 2 months from pole to pole, but found nothing. Nothing but shadows and whispers and the unending voices of the wind. Finally, he lifted his ship and went away. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And don't forget to check out the channel. There's hundreds of stories. Hundreds of stories.